There might not be too many Phantasy Star Online games left for me to cover. There might not be too many games directly attempting to build upon this series and recapture it the way, say, Diablo has. But there is this fan game, a Phantasy Star Online fan game built on top of a Sonic fan game built on the Doom engine. You might also be familiar with a kart racer built on this same Sonic fan game built on the Doom engine, but today we're focusing on the Phantasy Star one because, well, if the answer to that isn't obvious, hi, welcome to my channel. I've done a bunch of videos on Phantasy Star Online. Check them out. And if you're somehow watching this while not being familiar with Phantasy Star, also check those out, since for brevity a lot of this video will assume you know Phantasy Star Online. So this is Sonic Robo Blast 2 Infinity. Maybe you know it if you play Portable 2 Infinity, since it's named after it, and this has also gotten some shoutouts on the Portable 2 Infinity wiki. While there's some elements that are original or are symptoms of the engine it's built on, the elements taken directly from Phantasy Star are a mix of Portable 2 and PSO 2. So in that sense it kind of feels like a game in between those two that we never got. Or at least it would if Phantasy Star was the sort of franchise back then that ever did any gradual changes, rather than just sharply snapping into a completely new design philosophy. And since it is a mod built on a fan game, built on an engine that's open source, it's completely free. If you want to play it, still watch the rest of the video because I desperately need the engagement, but also the links are down in the description to both the Sonic Robo Blast 2 game that this is built on top of, and the mod itself. And just to be upfront with this, my criticism is probably going to be on the blunt side of things, because I can't avoid putting it directly up against the games that inspired it. This is, after all, a series I devoted 2 years of my life to covering extensively in like 8 hours of video. But I want to make it clear, lest you think that I'm being too harsh, that while I will still point out the flaws, I am broadly much more forgiving of them here. This is an impressive fan game that is still better than several of the games in the series that inspired it, but I've also been hard on those games, even when they mean a lot to me and do a lot right. So regardless of how critical I am at parts, just remember this is a really great fan game that exceeded my expectations on pretty much every front. The gameplay is fairly similar to what you'll be familiar with from Portable 2 Infinity. In particular, it's definitely more towards the lethal end of the series combat, with enemy hits taking off large chunks of your health even as a hunter. Though with minimal penalty for death, it's not as though this is a huge deal. The big thing is that there is a PSO 2 style action palette for each of your equipped weapons. Two-handed weapons get 6 slots, while one-handed weapons get 3 slots, and instead of switching between a front and back palette, you switch between your main and offhand weapon. Unfortunately, there's no weapon actions like PSO 2, and not even a general guard like in Portable 2. And then there's my favorite addition, which is that you can now swap weapons via the number keys. Like in Portable 2, you have 6 slots each for weapons, armor, and consumables, but because this is on PC, you can use the number keys to switch weapons. Or if you hit 7 first, you can use them to quickly use a consumable. Weapon swapping has always been a key part of the aughts era of PSO, and this little feature makes it so much faster and more exciting. This game isn't Devil May Cry, but this reminds me of DMC just a little, with how all of your weapons are always just a quick button press away. Additionally, chains are back, and not nearly as dominant as in Portable 2 Infinity. For those unaware, your basic attacks build up a chain, and your special attacks end the chain but gain a damage boost. Compared to Portable 2, instead of a single chain hit providing slightly more than double damage, a single hit chain will at best provide a 40% damage increase, with chains being less effective the more players you have. And then there's diminishing returns with each hit in the chain until by around 7 hits you're only gaining 2% damage per hit. Still something that can add up quickly with the right weapon, but it's all much more measured and sensible than the system in Portable 2, which rendered additional effects of photon arts largely irrelevant in the face of the sheer amount of damage that chain breaks could deliver. Though the photon art selection here is merely fine, you'll have reason to use most of your palette, but it does feel a little more PSO2 than PSU. Attacks differ in range, AoE, damage, and animation, but generally lack the ability to affect enemies differently. And this does reduce the gains you get from the more sensible chain system. There's not much Photon Arch can do besides damage enemies, so even if it had the high damage scaling of Portable 2, there wouldn't be much for it to derail. But it's honestly probably a symptom of the engine more than anything, and at least there are a few that feel more radically different, like a rifle Photon Art that doubles as a dodge, or a spear Photon Art that continuously attacks as long as you hold it down, or swords at least having one Photon Art that can kind of launch and juggle enemies. And while you do have to learn Photon Arts through discs, there's no levels and most of them can be bought. Unfortunately, the 3 core playstyles of melee, ranged, and Tex are just not as differentiated as they are in other games in the series, which I suppose is a symptom of taking from PSO2. At least with the class skill systems we'll get to later on, even if the playstyles aren't radically different, the classes are. Healing with items is instant, but it does have a cooldown. Something like this to keep people from just spamming healing items is good, especially in action and skill-focused RPGs, and ones in which you get enough healing items that running out isn't an issue. It serves the same function as the potion drinking animations in Monster Hunter, Dark Souls, or base PSO2. It prevents things from looking like PSU, where you're just healing through all the damage you take, and prevents ease of healing from taking the fun out of things. That said, it is a bit rough when combined with the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, enemies hit really hard, and it is very possible to get multi-hit to death before you have time to even consider healing. You'd better not be hit again in that long cooldown between healing items, because it only takes a couple of hits to take you from full to 0. Or some things might even just one-shot you. Fortunately, there's no penalty for dying on most missions except a reduced rank, which barely affects your rewards, so PSO's inconsistent difficulty is alive and well here. Speaking of difficulty, status effects. They are brutal. Freeze especially reclaims its status of instant death with extra steps. There's no way to mash out of it sooner, it doesn't end early if you're hit. Yeah, it's scary, though you actually can heal out of it with a soul atomizer. It's not like the old games in that regard, and I died so many times because I was just resigned to my fate and didn't think to try a soul atomizer. But a 5-second duration is the norm, and for some of these status effects it can feel like an eternity. Unfortunately, a lot of issues with the gameplay stem from the fact that you can tell it's not built from the ground up. It's a fan game built on top of a fan game, built on top of an entirely different game, and each layer of that is a fundamentally different genre. The fact that any of this works at all is sorcery. The biggest issue here is that a lot of the gameplay feels loose and imprecise with a lot of physics-based momentum. Makes sense for a Sonic game, you want that to feel fluid, and momentum is a key part of conveying speed, and managing your momentum should be a key part of gameplay there. But for the sort of action RPG that the later Phantasy Star Online games are, along with stuff like Dark Souls and Monster Hunter, these are games that first and foremost need to feel tight and precise. They feel best when you input a dodge and can understand exactly where you will land, and where your animations feel predictable enough that you can time things perfectly. A lot of it comes from the fact that animations are admittedly a little slow, and anything that sends you into the air is floaty and physics-based. Your dodge roll is a sort of short hop that flings you a good distance away and feels extremely imprecise because of the slight float at the end, so I find it generally feels awkward to come out of it and try to immediately go on the offensive. And the enemies all feel a little slow, a little low on impact, and there's very little chance to cancel out of end lag to make things feel snappier. Plus, enemies don't really have a sense of weight to them. Enemy design's probably the weakest part of the game, unfortunately, and as I often say, enemy design is a critical but often underappreciated part of the design of these sorts of games. There's not a lot of animation to help you time your dodges, and due to being, a game on the Doom engine, enemy facing is pretty primitive and not well communicated, which in turn devalues positioning. Honestly, Unfortunately, most of the enemies present do not feel well designed for a melee character in particular. The most common enemies that try and attack you in melee that you'll find tend to strictly perform charging attacks, and if you commonly play melee characters in these games, you probably get why having enemies be all charge attacks all the time kind of sucks. Not only do they limit your ability to control the fight by controlling the distance, but they tend to carry the enemy past the player, breaking any face-to-face conflict that makes melee fun, and with the long floaty dodge the game has, it's made even worse. Instead of tight head-to-head combat, melee in this game tends to feel like this odd cycle of dodging and chasing down an enemy, hoping you can get in and stun lock them before they can charge off and get away again. So unfortunately, combat, especially melee combat, just does not feel quite as great as Portable 2 or PSO 2. It's no one thing that really torpedoes it all, but the sum of most of what I've mentioned compounding the other flaws. Enemies deal a lot of damage, so you have to heal more. But you have a fairly long cooldown on healing, so you can't just brute force through with items. So these two should put it in a Dark Souls or Monster Hunter style of game that puts more emphasis on defense and positioning, but that's undermined due to the limited enemy variety, limited defenses aside from the floaty dodge move, and lack of animations to react to. It ultimately just feels hard for all the wrong reasons. But despite all this, there's still ideas here that are great, and I'd say that the combat is still better than something like Phantasy Star Zero's inoffensive but bland combat. And hey, most of this stuff could be improved in future updates. Moving over to the RPG system side of things, these feel more like PSO2, though with some affectations towards being a bit more like Infinity. Take the class system, for instance. You have the typical Hunter, Ranger, Force trio. If more are added when you're watching this, that's all that the game had when I played it. You can switch between them as you like, and you have a single character level. No individual levels per class like PSO2, or split character and class levels like in the Gerhal games. You level 1 to 50 with a Hunter, you also level 50 with Ranger and Force. The first real highlight here is the skill system, which uses a point system more like Portable 2's, but instead of unlocking skills for all types as you raise each type's level, each class has its own set of skills that unlock as you level up. But with that said, the overall quality of the skill selection is higher than in Portable 2, or honestly even PSO 2. There's a lot of skills that can really change how your class plays. I'm personally a fan of the Hunter skill that lets them block attacks by using photon arts with good timing, or the Ranger skill that summons a turret when you break a chain, and the skill system is interestingly where the game's blast mechanic comes in. Photon blasts are skills you have to unlock and equip, but otherwise work pretty much how you'd expect. Less positively, while they do use the type extend system from Portable 2, with only a few weapon types comparable to PSO2, it really suffers. I mean, I guess you can play a Hunter with a rifle or something, but there's not a ton of choices to make here. There's not the wide slate of weapons like in Portable 2 that at least turn the extend system into something that can make everyone's playthrough different. And honestly, I didn't even like the extend system very much in Portable 2, because there it reduced class identity while also feeling restrictive. Here, it's just a poor fit since it can't even realize the benefits of giving you a real custom class. There aren't enough weapons on offer, and you can't customize your class with skills from other classes. But then the loot. If you followed my Phantasy Star Online videos, you'll know that I always complain about how the loot is inferior to PSO's, and how it just seems to get weaker with each installment. So know that I am not understating it when I say that holy shit, Sonic Robo Blast 2 Infinity's loot is so good. The big appeal is, of course, the weapons. This isn't Monster Hunter after all. Weapons all have clearly defined passives called potentials. Unlike some games, they're diverse, interesting, available as soon as you get the weapon, and sometimes have pretty big impacts on how you use the weapon. And the evolution of potentials is a part of progression through the game. Early, common weapons will tend to have fairly basic potentials. Then when you get a rare series weapon, they'll come with a bit more, although something shared among all of the weapons in the series. And then when you get into the late game unique rares, these will have unique potentials that can completely change how the game plays, making them particularly exciting. The only randomization on gear is element, which works like PSO2. Enemies can have weaknesses, usually 2 different ones, and weapons have an element and percentage. This is randomly determined, but like PSO2, if you get an unidentified weapon, a techer can allow you to choose your element, and by paying, you can increase the percentage. But looking at the damage formula, it's probably not worth increasing beyond the minimum 30%, at least until you get into the very highest tier stuff that you might as well max out. I'll put the exact information on screen, but suffice to say going from 30% to 60% does not provide a 30% damage increase. It's closer to a 5% increase. Nothing but questionable, especially for the amount of money it takes to get all the way to 60. Oh, and weapons do also have photon art cost and power multipliers like in Portable 2, and they are clearly shown to you. Definitely outdoing Portable 2 there by not hiding one of the few things that could make gear interesting in that game. And let's wind that back a little. I mentioned weapon series. To be clear, these are how I describe the gear in New Genesis and late game PSO2. You have a weapon series with a weapon in every or nearly every type, and weapons in that series will be equivalent to each other and usually have the same additional abilities. Now in New Genesis, I strongly dislike this. While they've gotten a little better about this with some series, generally this serves to make the late game stuff less interesting and unique. You don't get the unique weapon, you get a weapon of the series, and hopefully it's the right one for you. It just feels like cutting corners and making things less distinctive. But Roboblast to Infinity finds a way to make these interesting. They serve as intermediate rares, rare weapons you can acquire before you get to the endgame unique stuff, so that the early and mid game aren't all boring common weapons. And this is pretty great. The series-based nature of them even lets them implement a feature to exchange 2 in a series for any one other. They allow the game to have something more interesting than common weapons during the early and mid-game, but because they're inherently kind of less interesting than unique weapons, it won't sting as much when they are inevitably pushed aside by progression. There's no risk that your favorite unique weapon will be stuck as some B-rank junk rare that you use for maybe 2 hours. And weapon upgrades work weirdly like a mix of Portable 2 and the original PSO. You have mono, die, and tri grinders as items, which upgrade a weapon 1, 2, or 3 levels respectively, like in the original PSO, but like Portable 2, there's a much greater stat increase per upgrade and a cap of 10 upgrades. No chance of failure, like in PSU. Generally, a full plus 10 will bring a weapon up to equivalent of an unupgraded weapon of the next tier up, which I appreciate because it does give you a chance to use the weapon you upgraded a little longer instead of it immediately becoming obsolete as soon as you get a better drop. I'd actually preferred if it was a little bit stronger than an unupgraded weapon of the next tier. Unfortunately, armor and modules are just fine. Armor's armor, nothing special like you sometimes had in PSO, unfortunately, and modules are the genericized sort used outside of PSU. Armor slots work like in Portable 2, so you don't have to worry about random slots on armor. But modules are, while not as great as in PSO, at least better than Portable 2. There's even a few, mostly available in the post-game, that give more unique effects than just boosting your core stats. Also, I have no idea how element works on armor, even though they have elements just like in the Gerhal games. The wiki is no help, so if you do know, please add it to the wiki. But despite armor and modules being a little weaker, for weapons, this is the best loot since the original PSO, and that means a lot. Given the fact that this is built on top of 2 different games, neither of which are RPGs, the fact that the systems are as good as they are is really impressive. The skill system is probably better than any of the official games, provided the game-defining skills of PSO2 or NGS, without the filler skills of PSO2 or the design of NGS that doesn't even feel like it's from an RPG. And the design of the loot, at least the weapons, is the best since the original PSO. I'm genuinely happy that, at least in a few areas, this game managed to exceed the majority of the titles that inspired it. And Robo Blast 2 Infinity does have a kind of fun, weird concept for the world. It's kind of like a Sonic fanfic set in the distant future of the setting with some Phantasy Star elements mixed in. A fun way to rationalize the assets used from the base game, or the regular Sonic Robo Blast 2, with a plot that sort of hand-waves your recolored Sonic characters fighting the remains of Eggman's badniks before things get taken over by an eldritch horror, as is true of both most Phantasy Star games and most Sonic games since the series went 3D. But being this sort of story based more on the Sonic series does detract from things a bit, and let's be clear, this is 100% a me problem, but there's also a not unreasonable chance this applies to you as well. I'm not hugely invested in Sonic, haven't been in many, many years, and to make this even more specifically a me issue, well, Sonic, like Phantasy Star, has many different eras. My engagement with Sonic was solidly in the aughts era, the Sonic Adventure titles and those immediately following from them. Meanwhile, this, thanks to the game it's built on, is primarily based on the 90s era of Sonic, the Genesis titles and the comics, shows, etc. based directly on them. So yeah, totally a me issue, but I'm just not that into the part of the Sonic franchise this draws from. That said, actually playing through the story is pretty great, though there is not really any side quests and the post-game is rather underwhelming. There's a few extra modes, but mostly I find myself replaying the hard mode versions of story missions to farm 10-star rares. It's not the most compelling, but it ends up leaving the game with a feeling similar to how I felt after playing Phantasy Star Zero. Play the story, fuck around a little afterwards, don't worry about sinking 100 hours into the post-game like you would in some of the other titles. Though that said, I will say it is better than Zero, with a longer story, better pacing with several shorter missions in each zone instead of one massive one, and post-game rares that are actually interesting and feel worth it to farm for if you do really want to do the post-game. Also, there's no Eternal Tower, mandatory or otherwise. That alone makes it substantially better than Zero. Also, despite my complaints that I couldn't get that into the setting, fortunately the story is mostly told like the original PSOs, optional dialogue, and data pods. You can pay as much or as little attention to it as you like, which I think is probably good. Trying to push the story, especially in a fan game like this, is risky business. I mean, heck, look at Phantasy Star Portable 2, one of the official games. I love the gameplay, but having to play through the story to unlock all the missions is easily the worst part of it. That said, the stages are pretty cool and there's some pretty creative design here. They do the original PSO thing of having one map layout used multiple times, but with the mission determining what areas you can go through and what order you visit them in. With a few more side quests, this could work really well to give each area its own sense of identity and familiarity. Though sometimes the stages do rely on gimmicks a bit much. The moon base level was infuriating with how badly the gravity messes with the mechanics. Physics was already an issue with the combat, and this just exacerbates the worst parts of it. But thankfully most of the other gimmicks don't overstay their welcome. And unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, enemy variety is lacking. Only in the late game do they start introducing a number of more interesting enemy types. For most of the game, it's the same handful of enemies with a few extras that fit the same niches as charging attack or shooting attack. Sadly, the world and the levels are probably where the game feels at its weakest, but that just means there's room for improvement. And I think there's a lot of potential for them to improve because, while I don't always agree with the ideas, the execution, mostly telling the story through optional dialogue and data pods, and the choice to have consistent, unchanging levels but instead change your route through them, the execution's great. Being blunt, this probably won't fill your need for a full mainline PSO title like the original PSU or PSO2, or even replace Portable 2. I mean, obviously, it's a small fan project and one that's still being worked on, and it is built on a Sonic game that is built on Doom through some kind of techno-sorcery. A lot of the issues I have with the game feel probably come from that, and it does make everything they do achieve kind of a miracle. I might have been particularly blunt with my criticisms, but I do think the game is great, and most of the flaws are more due to straining against the limitations of the engine and their limited resources. I'm inherently going to be more forgiving of flaws in a free fan project compared to in a for-profit game with a huge amount of resources, even if in my process I'm equally analytical of both games. Plus, this is all coming from a fairly critical guy who has played the whole series over the past couple years. If you're just looking for some fun and you haven't gone back to any of the aughts games since the aughts, you'll probably not be as picky as I am. It's all a matter of expectations and what you want out of a game after all. But hey, I've said before that I miss the era of handheld spin-offs, and this would fit that era perfectly. Heck, as I've said before, it kind of matches the story playthrough focus of Phantasy Star Zero, while being honestly much better than that game. If I were to put it in my tier list from my big series retrospective, I'd easily give this a high B tier. There are a few sections, particularly in the systems, where I can point to parts of the game and say, this is one of the best or the best implementation of this system in any game in the franchise. So I highly recommend you give it a shot. And to the creators, if you're watching and have stuck with this video this long, despite me being pretty blunt and critical, keep up the amazing work on this mod. I look forward to seeing how it progresses. And if you ever create anything beyond this mod in the future, I would love to see it. To my knowledge, you're the only ones out there giving PSO a successor the way Diablo has several. So if you like Phantasy Star Online, and if you've ever clicked on any of my videos, you probably do, this is absolutely worth a go. Links will be in the description. Check it out and let me know in the comments what you think. I may have been hard on it, but I still think it's better than many of the actual Phantasy Star Online games, and it does bring me back to the late aughts era of Phantasy Star that is where I fell in love with this franchise. But for now, this is Mikhail, signing off.